step inside the royal palace of Spain in the 1800s, where velvet curtains hid scandals darker than any battlefield. Behind the crown and the ceremonies stood Ferdinand VII, a king whose appetites and obsessions earned him the title of one of history's most perverted rulers. While his people suffered poverty and political chaos, Ferdinand indulged in grotesque pleasures, twisted affairs, and secret rituals that shocked even those closest to the throne. His reign wasn't remembered for wisdom or glory, but for betrayal, corruption, and private vices that blurred the line between monarchy and madness. These are the shadows that official history tried to cover. But today, we're pulling them back. Drop the time you're watching this in the comments. I love seeing when my history travelers tune in. And if exploring the forbidden truths of history excites you, subscribing is totally up to you. But the next revelations will leave you speechless. In Madrid in 1784, a child was born into the royal palace. His name was Ferdinand, and from the very beginning, his life was surrounded by tension. The palace looked grand, with velvet curtains and glittering chandeliers, but behind those walls were constant arguments, rumors, and secrets. Instead of growing up in an atmosphere of peace, Ferdinand grew up in a place where trust was scarce and power games never stopped. His father, King Charles IV, was not a strong ruler. People described him as kind but simple a man who preferred hunting and hobbies to the heavy responsibilities of leading Spain. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, was the opposite, ambitious, forceful, and often accused of being unfaithful. The most damaging rumor was about Manuel Godoy, a young courtier who rose rapidly thanks to the Queen's protection. Many believed he was more than just a trusted advisor. This meant that Ferdinand, even as a child, saw his family mocked and questioned, and he grew up surrounded by gossip that damaged the dignity of the crown. From such an environment, Ferdinand learned suspicion early. Tutors and courtiers constantly praised him, telling him he was brilliant, the true hope of Spain. He started believing it, and his pride grew stronger. But instead of learning responsibility, he learned resentment. He despised his father for being weak. He hated Godoy for taking so much power, and he looked at his mother with mistrust because of the scandals tied to her name. Think for a moment if you were raised in a home where every adult lied, schemed, or argued, what kind of person would you become? For Ferdinand, honesty never became a habit. Deception was normal, and he practiced it from a young age. By his teenage years, he was already a key figure in palace plots. Nobles who disliked Godoy whispered in his ear, telling him he could be Spain's savior if he acted against his parents. He listened carefully. He didn't focus on how to govern a country. He focused on how to remove the people he disliked. For him, power was not a duty, but a weapon to strike at his rivals. Even the servants noticed his behavior. They saw how he enjoyed humiliating those below him, how angry he became when things didn't go his way. These were early signs of a cruel streak. He wasn't interested in kindness or fairness. He was interested in control. Other royal children also faced difficult upbringings. Louis XVI of France, for example, grew up shy and clumsy, often laughed at by his own court. But Ferdinand's childhood shaped him differently. He was not crushed by the corruption around him. He absorbed it and turned it into his way of living. Instead of rejecting the poison of the court, he embraced it. Meanwhile, Spain was weakening, The empire's colonies abroad were restless. Napoleon was reshaping Europe, and revolutions were spreading new ideas. In the middle of these storms stood Ferdinand, a boy convinced that the throne belonged to him, but equally convinced that almost everyone around him was plotting against him. That mix of entitlement and paranoia set the stage for the man he would become. Ferdinand was not preparing to be a responsible king. He was preparing to turn against his own father and take the crown for himself. As Ferdinand grew older, the royal palace became less like a home and more like a stage where he acted out his sense of superiority. He was showered with comforts that would make any ordinary teenager today shake their head in disbelief. Expensive clothes, lavish meals, endless ceremonies, it was all handed to him. While other boys his age might have been learning trades or preparing for military service, Ferdinand's life revolved around being praised, pampered, and placed at the center of attention. The spoiling wasn't just material. It was psychological. His tutors and guardians taught him to see himself as flawless, as if the nation existed only to confirm his importance. This constant indulgence made him arrogant. Instead of building patience or discipline, he learned that losing his temper was enough to get what he wanted. Servants described moments when he would throw tantrums if things didn't go his way. And courtiers quickly learned that flattery was the safest way to handle him. The pattern was clear. Ferdinand became addicted to praise, and he punished anyone who withheld it. Can you imagine the kind of adult that grows out of such habits? The court also encouraged his vanity. Portraits were painted to exaggerate his dignity, public ceremonies displayed him as the hope of Spain, and every detail of his life was carefully managed to reinforce the idea that he was special. Yet behind the stage lights, his actual character was shallow. He lacked intellectual curiosity, avoided deep study, and had little interest in the complex matters of governance. What truly excited him was the game of manipulation, setting one courtier against another, spreading rumors, and pretending to be more innocent than he really was. If you think about it, this resembles the behavior of a modern celebrity who thrives on scandal rather than talent. Ferdinand's talent wasn't leadership. It was playing people off against each other. And he practiced it constantly. He realized early that the easiest way to gain support was to exploit dissatisfaction with Manuel Godoy, the Queen's favorite. By siding with those who despised Godoy, Ferdinand positioned himself as the alternative, the prince who would restore dignity once he became king. This is where you start to see the gap between appearance and reality. Outwardly, Ferdinand was celebrated as the charming young heir. Inwardly, he was cultivating distrust, collecting allies, and sharpening his ability to deceive. The more he was spoiled, the more he believed he deserved not only the throne, but absolute control over everyone around him. Real-life examples help here. Consider how spoiled heirs in other nations often grew reckless, like Louis XV of France, who was raised in indulgence and later became known for extravagance rather than responsibility. Ferdinand fit the same pattern. He wanted the privileges of kingship without the burdens. He wanted the admiration of the people, but none of the responsibility to serve them. As a young man, Ferdinand also grew increasingly skilled at playing the victim. He let others believe he was the one suffering under his parents' poor choices and Godoy's dominance. This role earned him sympathy, especially among nobles who disliked the queen. But make no mistake, Ferdinand's victimhood was an act. In reality, he thrived on stirring resentment, and the more people pitied him, the more powerful he felt. Even his daily habits reflected this selfish streak. He often ignored traditional etiquette, dismissing the dignity of others if it clashed with his desires. He had little respect for those who worked hard to support him. Instead, he saw them as tools to be used or discarded. The court, desperate to keep him content, only deepened this attitude. When you are told from childhood that you can do no wrong, eventually you stop even trying to do what's right. By the time he entered adulthood, Ferdinand had already developed into someone dangerous. He lacked the education of a capable ruler, but he had mastered the art of deceit. He had no record of serving Spain, but he had already convinced many that he alone was the nation's salvation. He wasn't yet wearing the crown, but in his mind, the throne was already his. The spoiled heir had finished rehearsing. Now, he was ready to turn those lessons of manipulation against his own father. When you step deeper into Ferdinand's story, the palace intrigues start to look less like whispers and more like open plotting. By the early 1800s, Ferdinand was no longer just the spoiled heir sulking in his chambers. He was an active conspirator against his own father, King Charles IV. Imagine that instead of supporting the man who gave him both life and a throne to inherit, Ferdinand worked behind the scenes to undermine him. The Spanish court, already a nest of rivalries, now had a prince secretly weaving his own web of betrayal. The main target was still Manuel Godoy, the all-powerful favorite of Queen Maria Luisa. Godoy was deeply unpopular with much of the nobility, who resented how this upstart from a minor family held such influence. Ferdinand tapped into that resentment, presenting himself as the alternative leader who would restore honor to Spain. He carefully played the role of the wronged son, whispering to aristocrats and clerics that once he was king, the corruption of Godoy would end. The nobles didn't need much convincing. They were already desperate to see Godoy fall, and Ferdinand became their perfect banner. But Ferdinand didn't stop at private complaints. He allowed factions to form around him, groups of courtiers who pledged loyalty not to the sitting king, but to the prince waiting in the wings. His correspondence with foreign ambassadors even revealed his willingness to seek outside help if it would bring him closer to the crown. For a royal family, this was nothing short of scandalous. The line between healthy ambition and treason grew dangerously thin. Think of it like a company where the vice president is actively trying to push the CEO out of office, except in this case, the company was Spain itself, already weakened by war and debt. Instead of unity, the royal household became a battlefield. Every decision King Charles IV made was shadowed by suspicion. Was Ferdinand supporting him, or quietly plotting to overthrow him? The situation reached a climax with the so-called conspiracy of El Escorial in 1807. Documents were discovered linking Ferdinand and his allies to a plot against Godoy, and even against the king himself. For a brief moment, it looked like Ferdinand's schemes would be exposed and punished. Charles IV, furious at his son, considered disinheriting him. But Ferdinand, ever the manipulator, switched tactics. He begged for forgiveness, played the humble child, and even wrote a groveling letter to his father, insisting he had been misled. It worked. The king pardoned him, and Ferdinand kept his position as heir. This episode revealed two important things about Ferdinand's character. First, he was willing to betray even his closest family to secure power. Second, he had no shame in reversing his stance if it helped him survive. One moment, he was plotting rebellion. The next moment, he was bowing like the most obedient son. That ability to wear masks, rebellious prince one day, tearful, penitent the next, was his true weapon. Other rulers in history also turned against their fathers, but usually with clearer reasons. For example, Frederick the Great of Prussia famously clashed with his father, but his rebellion came from wanting intellectual freedom. Ferdinand's motives were far less noble. He wasn't fighting for ideas or reforms. He was fighting for personal control and the removal of those he disliked. You might ask yourself, what kind of trust can a people place in a leader who betrays his own father before even becoming king? The answer, as Spain later discovered, is none at all. Ferdinand's early plots didn't just weaken Charles IV. They weakened the entire image of monarchy in Spain. The public began to see their rulers as divided, corrupt, and incapable of unity. And when a country is surrounded by powerful neighbors like Napoleon's France, that kind of weakness is deadly. By the time Ferdinand's role in the conspiracy was swept under the rug, one thing had become clear. He had no loyalty, no stable principles, and no hesitation in turning on anyone, even his own blood, if it meant getting closer to the throne. And it was exactly this instability that Napoleon Bonaparte would soon notice and exploit. Spain in 1808 was like a house already on fire, and Ferdinand was the man who ran inside not to save anyone, but to steal the silver. The empire was weakened, the court divided, and Napoleon's shadow loomed larger with each passing month. For Ferdinand, none of this was a warning. It was an opening. When French troops crossed into Spain, they claimed to be allies against Britain. In reality, they seized fortresses and occupied cities, showing that Napoleon's word mattered more than the Spanish king's. Resentment exploded into the Aranjuez Mutiny of March 1808. A mob supported by nobles stormed Godoy's residence, captured him, and demanded Charles IV's abdication. Amid the uproar, Ferdinand stepped forward, and suddenly he was king. The people cheered. For decades they had hated Godoy, and now they saw Ferdinand as their savior. Bells rang, streets filled with processions, and the new monarch was hailed as the desired one. At last, Ferdinand had what he wanted: the crown, the people's support, and his rival's destruction. But triumph came too easily, and Napoleon was watching. The emperor invited Ferdinand and his family to Bayonne, promising to mediate. Ferdinand accepted, blinded by ambition. Once there, he was pressured into renouncing his throne. Instead of returning the crown to Charles IV, Napoleon handed Spain to his brother Joseph Bonaparte. Ferdinand's reign had lasted less than 2 months, and now he was nothing more than a prisoner in France. The humiliation was complete. After years of plotting against his father, Ferdinand ended up powerless while his country fell into chaos. Spaniards who had celebrated him felt betrayed when they realized he had walked straight into Napoleon's trap. In exile, Ferdinand perfected his double game. To Napoleon, he offered loyalty if restored. To Spanish rebels, he hinted he would soon return as their rightful king. But his empty promises convinced no one. Napoleon saw through his weakness, and patriots back home doubted his courage. Meanwhile, Spain was consumed by the Peninsular War. Guerrillas fought French soldiers in the mountains. The British sent troops, and villages were left starving. Ordinary people gave everything for their homeland, while Ferdinand sat in comfort abroad scheming for his throne. Unlike rulers such as Charles II of England, who used exile to build support, Ferdinand wasted his time waiting for others to solve his problems. By 1813, Napoleon's empire was collapsing. French troops withdrew, and Ferdinand was free to return. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the people believed the nightmare was over. 6 years of war had left the country battered towns, destroyed families grieving, and the economy in ruins. Crowds welcomed him with tears and applause, calling him El Deseado, the Desired One. They imagined a king who had learned from exile, who would thank his people for their sacrifice, and who would guide Spain into a new era of strength. But Ferdinand had no such intentions. Instead of gratitude, he offered betrayal. One of the first things Ferdinand faced was the Constitution of 1812, written in Cadiz while he was in France. This document, produced by Spain's first parliament, was one of the most progressive in Europe. It limited royal power, gave citizens rights, and promised a balance between monarchy and representation. For the soldiers, citizens, and intellectuals who had fought and bled during the Peninsular War, this constitution was a symbol of hope. They believed Ferdinand would respect it, perhaps even improve it. But Ferdinand saw the constitution not as hope, but as a threat. To him, limiting the king's authority was unthinkable. The moment he stepped back onto Spanish soil, he began plotting to tear it apart. And within weeks, he did. In May 1814, with the support of conservative generals and the church, Ferdinand abolished the constitution, dissolved parliament, and restored absolute monarchy. In a single stroke, the dreams of reformers and patriots were crushed. You can almost picture the stunned silence that followed. The same people who had fought guerrilla battles against Napoleon's soldiers, who had endured famine and sacrifice, now realized their own king had stripped away the freedoms they had won. Instead of reward, they were given repression. It was like a cruel twist. In a play, the villain everyone thought defeated returned to steal the stage once again. Ferdinand wasted no time proving how ruthless he could be. He ordered the arrest of liberals, censored the press, and filled prisons with anyone who dared speak in favor of reform. Soldiers who had once shouted "Viva Ferdinand" found themselves punished for questioning his rule. Citizens who had risked their lives to defend Spain discovered their voices meant nothing. The so-called Desired One quickly earned a new nickname, El Rey Felon, the treacherous king. History offers many examples of leaders who returned from exile with gratitude. Napoleon, when he escaped, won back support by promising reform, even if it was short-lived. Charles II of England forgave many of his enemies when he regained his throne. Ferdinand, however, chose the opposite path. He saw mercy as weakness, and instead of reconciling with his people, he turned against them. It wasn't just politics, it was personal cruelty. Ferdinand seemed to enjoy undoing whatever others had built in his absence. His return wasn't about lifting Spain from hardship. It was about proving that no law, no parliament, no people could ever limit him. He believed the throne was not a responsibility, but a possession like a jewel or a toy that belonged only to him. The disappointment spread quickly. Intellectuals fled into exile fearing persecution. Soldiers who had once fought proudly under Spain's flag now wondered if their sacrifices had been in vain. Even peasants who had little interest in politics felt the sting of higher taxes and the heavy hand of censorship. The man they had hailed as their savior was dragging Spain backwards into darkness, and the irony was painful. The Spanish had suffered terribly under Napoleon's brother Joseph, only to discover that their own native king could be just as destructive. At least Joseph had introduced some reforms. Ferdinand erased them all. By 1815, Spain was not celebrating its freedom, but sinking into fear once again. The cheers that greeted Ferdinand's return had turned into whispers of regret. Spain had survived foreign occupation, but now it faced something worse, a tyrant of its own making. The longer Ferdinand sat on the throne, the more his taste for control revealed itself, not just in politics, but in his private whims. He was no philosopher king, no strategist, no reformer. What he craved was domination, for laws for courtiers, and even for the smallest details of daily life. He treated power not as a burden to carry, but as a personal amusement, bending people into humiliating shapes just to watch them obey. At court, his reputation quickly turned sour. Ministers dreaded his unpredictable moods because one day he might flatter them, and the next he could destroy their careers with a single order. Ferdinand did not enjoy surrounding himself with strong or capable advisors. Instead, he handpicked flatterers, men and women, who would nod at everything he said and laugh at jokes that weren't funny. This meant that decisions for the kingdom were often made not on reason, but on Ferdinand's passing temper. Spain's government became a mirror of his unstable personality, suspicious, petty, and constantly lashing out. Stories circulated about his private cruelties. He took particular delight in watching courtiers squirm. If he sensed weakness, he pressed on it, demanding displays of loyalty that bordered on absurd. Some nobles were forced to endure insults in front of others just to prove they were obedient. Others were ordered to carry out tasks beneath their dignity, a way for Ferdinand to remind them that their status meant nothing if he willed it so. It was like watching a schoolyard bully who happened to be king, except his playground was an entire empire. Consider how this compares with rulers elsewhere. In Britain, George III, despite his bouts of illness, was remembered for his interest in farming and education. In France, Louis XVI, restored after Napoleon, tried at least to balance royal authority with constitutional ideas. Ferdinand, by contrast, showed no such interest. His hobbies were not in science, art, or learning, they were in breaking down people's pride. He was less a ruler of Spain and more a tormentor of those unlucky enough to serve him. The pattern of cruelty reached even into his approach to governance. He saw reformers not as political opponents, but as enemies to be crushed. Those who wanted freedom of the press or fairer taxation were branded traitors. He revived the Inquisition's influence, used censorship to silence new ideas, and rewarded secret police for spying on citizens. For Ferdinand, the throne was not just about ruling. It was about making sure no one could ever challenge his authority or expose his weaknesses. It is telling that during his reign, Spain sank deeper into backwardness, while other European countries cautiously modernized. While Britain built factories and France experimented with new laws, Ferdinand clung to the past like a drowning man clutching a stone. He thought that control meant safety, but in reality, his obsession with domination drained Spain's future. The court reflected this suffocating atmosphere. Imagine being a young noble invited to Madrid. Instead of lively debates or opportunities to prove your talent, you found a king who might order you to act the fool for his amusement. Your survival depended not on skill, but on groveling. Over time, the palace filled with yes-men spies and sycophants, all competing to flatter Ferdinand louder than the next. It was a theater of obedience with the king as both playwright and critic. And here's the strange part. Ferdinand seemed to enjoy this warped environment. Where other rulers found joy in patronizing the arts or supporting discoveries, he found joy in making others feel small. His court became infamous for its emptiness. No great artists, no great thinkers, no ambitious reforms, just a circle of fearful faces waiting for the king's next whim. By this stage, Ferdinand was no longer simply a spoiled heir who had stumbled into power. He was shaping himself into something worse, a monarch whose delight came from seeing others reduced, humiliated, and broken down. And Spain, trapped under his rule, began to suffocate alongside them. Spain had endured Ferdinand's cruelty in government, but his private life was no less troubling. His marriages meant to strengthen the crown became stages for humiliation and obsession. If earlier he had tormented courtiers, now his queens carried the weight of his twisted demands. It is here in the chambers of the palace that Ferdinand's darker side reveals itself most clearly. Ferdinand married 4 times, and each union ended in sorrow. His first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, entered the marriage in 1802 as a young woman full of expectation. Instead of affection, she found herself the target of Ferdinand's suspicions. He accused her of siding with his enemies and of plotting against him. He let rumors swirl unchecked, isolating her within the court. By the time she died in 1806, many whispered that her death was hastened by the misery of life beside him. Later wives fared little better. Isabella of Portugal, Maria Josefa of Saxony, and Maria Cristina of Naples all faced the same cold pattern. Ferdinand treated them as pawns to be managed, not partners to be cherished. His paranoia bled into these marriages, making each queen's role a test of endurance rather than companionship. Instead of bringing peace to the palace, each new marriage added another chapter of tension and whispers. To modern ears, it sounds like the script of a toxic relationship, but with far higher stakes. These women were queens, and their treatment set the tone for the entire court. Servants watched carefully, diplomats reported anxiously, and the people outside the palace absorbed the gossip. Each failed marriage reflected not just on Ferdinand's character, but on Spain itself. One example captures this clearly. Maria Josefa of Saxony, Ferdinand's third wife, was known for her piety and kindness, yet she too could not escape his suspicions. She was mocked, sidelined, and left powerless in a court that revolved around the king's whims. Her gentle nature was no defense against Ferdinand's controlling streak. Compare this to rulers who built stable dynasties through their marriages. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Britain, though living later in the century, turned their partnership into a foundation for a confident monarchy. Even Napoleon, despite his personal scandals, recognized the importance of dynastic strength through marriage. Ferdinand, however, used marriage not to strengthen Spain, but to feed his insecurities. The last of his wives, Maria Cristina, endured him until his death in 1833. She gave birth to Isabella II, ensuring the continuation of the Bourbon line. Yet even this union was overshadowed by Ferdinand's reputation. Instead of being remembered as the father of a hopeful new queen, he was remembered as the husband who left his wives broken in spirit. For Ferdinand, marriage was never about love or even alliance, it was about control. Queens were expected to endure his temper, his suspicion, and his humiliation in silence. And in this silence, the image of the king grew darker. The man who had once betrayed his father now turned his cruelty inward onto the very women who shared his crown. By now, Ferdinand's court had come not just a stage of politics, but a theater of shadows where queens played tragic roles under the watch of a king who seemed to delight in their suffering. Step inside Ferdinand's palace during these years, and you find yourself in a place that feels less like a royal court and more like a suffocating theater of suspicion. The halls glittered with chandeliers and tapestries, but the true atmosphere was heavy with whispers, spying, and nervous glances. Everyone, from ministers to servants, knew that their survival depended on staying in the king's favor, and Ferdinand's favor could vanish overnight. He surrounded himself with flatterers, men and women, who competed to praise him, to nod at every word, and to act as if his every whim was genius. Real talent had no place here. Intellectuals, reformers, and skilled administrators either fled into exile or were silenced. In their place stood sycophants, whose loyalty was measured not by service to Spain, but by their willingness to kneel. The result was a court where decisions were rarely made for the good of the country. They were made to feed the king's ego. It wasn't just flattery Ferdinand craved. He built networks of informants, creating a culture of spying. Courtiers reported on one another, ministers were watched closely, and even conversations at banquets could be twisted into accusations. The palace became a maze of secrets where trust was almost impossible. Imagine trying to speak freely, knowing that the person next to you might repeat your words to the king the next morning. The paranoia that consumed Ferdinand spread like smoke through every chamber. This shadowy court left its mark on Spain's politics. With Ferdinand more concerned about loyalty than competence, the country fell behind its European neighbors. While Britain debated reforms and France experimented with new codes of law, Spain stagnated. The best minds were silenced, and innovation was treated with suspicion. It was as if the palace itself was holding the country hostage. One comparison makes the picture clearer. At the same time, the Austrian court under Metternich became famous for strict conservatism, but at least it operated with method and structure. Ferdinand's court, by contrast, had no such order. It was ruled by fear and favoritism. Policy shifted with his moods. Alliances rose and fell with his suspicions, and Spain drifted without direction. Inside the palace, Ferdinand's personal amusements only deepened the gloom. He enjoyed testing his courtiers, forcing them into uncomfortable displays of loyalty. Some were ordered to endure insults in public, while others had to perform humiliating tasks to prove their devotion. These rituals kept everyone on edge. To resist was dangerous. To comply was degrading. It was a game Ferdinand never seemed to tire of. For ordinary Spaniards, the effects were obvious. Taxes increased to support the lavish court censorship, smothered new ideas, and prisons filled with anyone suspected of disloyalty. The palace might have sparkled with jewels, but the kingdom outside it was starving for progress. And still Ferdinand seemed satisfied, as though surrounding himself with obedient faces was more important than feeding his people or strengthening his nation. The court became a reflection of the king's own character, insecure, cruel, and obsessed with appearances. Behind the golden doors and velvet curtains was not a center of wisdom, but a nest of fear. Anyone who entered soon realized they were stepping into a trap, where survival required silence and where truth itself had no safe place to stand. By the time Ferdinand's health began to falter, his palace was less a royal court and more a prison, except the bars were not iron, but paranoia and corruption. By the 1820s, Ferdinand's own body began to betray him, much like the kingdom he had spent years mismanaging. Years of indulgence paranoia and political games left him increasingly weak and ill. He suffered from gout, obesity, and other ailments that confined him to bed for long stretches. Courtiers whispered about his declining health, but no one dared to say aloud what everyone could see. The king was rotting from within, just as Spain was crumbling around him. The paranoia that had long guided his politics now grew sharper. Ferdinand trusted fewer and fewer people, constantly fearing betrayal. Ministers who had once been his favorites could be cast aside in an instant. Even his family was not safe from suspicion. It was as if illness amplified his worst qualities, leaving him trapped in a cycle of mistrust. His once grand court shrank into a small circle of sycophants and spies, the only people willing or foolish enough to endure his moods. Meanwhile, Spain's condition worsened. The country was deeply in debt. Its colonies in Latin America were breaking away one after another, and the promise of empire faded before everyone's eyes. Where Britain and France were building new trade networks and industrial power, Spain was losing both wealth and influence. Ferdinand's obsession with control had left the country behind. Roads and farms went neglected. Education stagnated, and entire regions slid into poverty. The king's answer to these problems was never reform, but repression. The so-called liberal triennium from 1820 to 1823, when reformers briefly forced Ferdinand to restore the Constitution of 1812, only highlighted his unwillingness to change. He pretended compliance, but in secret, he plotted against the liberals. When French troops, ironically called the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, arrived to restore him as absolute monarch, Ferdinand returned to power with even harsher vengeance. Those who had supported the Constitution were jailed, exiled, or executed. Spain fell back into silence and fear. By the late 1820s, his health had deteriorated further. Gout left him barely able to walk, his body swollen and riddled with pain. Courtiers carried him around the palace, while he issued decrees from a position of physical weakness but unrelenting arrogance. He seemed determined to cling to control even as his strength faded. Like a puppet master whose strings were fraying, he pulled harder, desperate not to lose his grip. The decline of his body mirrored the decline of Spain itself. Latin American independence movements succeeded one after another, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, all slipping away. A vast empire that had once made Spain rich now collapsed, and Ferdinand could do little to stop it. Instead of adapting, he blamed others, seeing plots and conspiracies where there were none. His inability to accept change doomed the nation to deeper decline. Think about the irony. The man who had spent his life trying to prove his strength was now reduced to weakness in both body and power. Yet even then, he refused humility. Rather than admit mistakes, he doubled down on suspicion, clinging to the throne, as if the act of ruling itself could keep him alive. When compared with other monarchs of the era, Ferdinand's decline stands out. George IV of Britain, though also plagued by illness and excess, at least presided over a country entering industrial growth. Louis XVI of France died, leaving behind a monarchy somewhat stabilized after Napoleon. Ferdinand left Spain poorer, weaker, and more divided than when he first claimed the crown. By the time the king's life neared its end, his legacy was already sealed in the minds of his subjects. They did not see a noble ruler who suffered in old age. They saw a tyrant whose cruelty had outlived his strength, and a country broken under his reign. The desired one had become the most despised. Spain's long ordeal under Ferdinand ended in 1833, but but the damage he left behind lingered far beyond his death. His reign had been a theater of cruelty and corruption, and when the curtain finally fell, the stage was littered with wreckage. The same people who had once welcomed him as El Deseado, the Desired One, now remembered him as El Rey Falon, the treacherous king. That reversal of names said everything about how far hopes had collapsed. Ferdinand's death opened the question of succession, and even this became a disaster. His fourth wife, Maria Cristina of Naples, had given him a daughter, Isabella. To secure her inheritance, Ferdinand issued pragmatic sanction, overturning the law that barred women from the throne. On paper, this ensured the Bourbon line would continue through Isabella II. In reality, it plunged Spain into a new civil conflict. Supporters of his brother, Don Carlos, rejected Isabella's claim, sparking the Carlist Wars, a brutal struggle that would haunt Spain for decades. So instead of leaving unity, Ferdinand left division. The country had barely recovered from foreign occupation and economic collapse, yet now it was thrust into another period of internal war. His attempt to secure his family's power only fueled new rivalries. It was the final irony, even in death, Ferdinand managed to spread conflict. The legacy of his rule was not reform, but stagnation. While other European nations cautiously embraced industrial growth, Spain under Ferdinand clung to outdated systems. Roads remained poor factories, scarce education underfunded. The empire in the Americas was gone, and the wealth it once brought had vanished with it. Spain, once a global power, stood diminished, isolated and suspicious of progress. People remembered not just his failures as a king, but his personal cruelty. The way he humiliated ministers, the way he turned his court into a prison of fear, and the way he treated his wives as tools rather than companions, all of it became part of his reputation. In history books, he appears less like a monarch and more like a cautionary tale. Think about the contrast. George Washington in America stepped down from power to preserve democracy. Napoleon, despite his wars, left behind a legal code that influenced Europe. Even less admirable rulers at least attempted to modernize. Ferdinand left nothing but bitterness. His reign offered no great vision, no lasting achievement, only scars. The Spanish people carried those scars into the future. The instability he created fed into decades of unrest, military coups, shifting constitutions, and civil wars. His choices ensured that Spain would spend much of the 19th century struggling to define itself. Every time reformers tried to modernize, the memory of Ferdinand's repression hung over them like a warning of how badly things could go. In the end, Ferdinand VII is remembered as one of the most disastrous kings Spain ever endured. He was not feared for his brilliance or admired for his courage. He was despised for his pettiness, his cruelty, and his refusal to change. The king who once promised salvation delivered only decay. And that is the dark secret of Ferdinand's story. The greatest danger to a nation is not always the invader at its gates, but the ruler on its throne who mistakes power for possession. Spain survived Napoleon, but it nearly collapsed under its own king. The story of Ferdinand VII leaves you with the picture of a Spain ruled by fear, corruption, and cruelty. But the king's twisted reign was only one part of a larger reality life, and the Spanish Empire itself was brutally hard. Behind the golden images of galleons and palaces lay a world of hunger, disease, endless labor, and punishments that made survival itself an achievement. If the palace was a theater of shadows, the empire was a battlefield of endurance. And the truth is simple. You probably wouldn't last a single day living under its crushing demands. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Not the sweet aroma of roasted coffee beans or fresh bread wafting from a corner bakery. No, in Madrid of the Spanish Empire, your nose fills with a cocktail of horse manure, rotting vegetables, and human waste tossed straight into the street. Imagine stepping out of a carriage or a creaky wooden doorway, only to dodge a bucket of slop that someone just emptied from a window above. Congratulations, you're alive in the empire's capital and already regretting it. People often imagine palaces and golden armor, but daily life. It's more like surviving a public toilet with architecture. The streets themselves are chaos crowded loud and packed with people from every walk of life. You've got nobles in fancy carriages demanding space merchants shouting over each other to sell questionable goods, and beggars tugging at your sleeves with stories of hunger. Every alley echoes with the clatter of wooden wheels, the braying of donkeys, and the cries of fishmongers hawking their catch before it spoils. And the ground under your feet, mud mixed with who knows what. One wrong step, and your shoes become a tragic story. You thought New York rush hour was bad. Try navigating this without getting trampled by livestock. Disease, of course, lurks in every corner. With open sewage, no real trash disposal, and water that might kill you faster than it quenches thirst, surviving even a casual stroll is a gamble. Historians estimate that outbreaks of plague fevers and dysentery routinely swept through Spanish cities. Think about it today. You sneeze on a train, and people side-eye you. Back then, one cough could be the beginning of a neighborhood tragedy. And don't expect doctors to save you unless you count a barber with a rusty blade and a jar of leeches as medical expertise. Noise makes it impossible to find peace. Church bells ring at ungodly hours, vendors shout themselves hoarse, and crowds gather for every rumor, whether it's a royal birth or just a street brawl. Even famous travelers like Madame d'Aulnoy, who visited Madrid in the 17th century, wrote with both fascination and disgust at how overwhelming it all felt. Imagine visiting a city where privacy doesn't exist, and every detail of your life spills into the cobblestones. You don't just live in Madrid. You survive it with your senses on constant high alert. And the irony, the royal palace gleams just beyond this chaos, guarded by soldiers in polished uniforms. Inside, chandeliers glitter and silk rustles. Outside, you're swatting flies and praying your boots don't dissolve in muck. That gap between wealth and misery defines the empire. For the ruling class, Spain's capital was the jewel of Europe. For you, an ordinary soul, it's a gauntlet you're already failing. If you thought the streets were cruel, wait until you dress for them. Fashion in the Spanish Empire isn't just about looking good. It's about surviving layers of suffocation disguised as elegance. Men wrap themselves in stiff doublets so tight you can barely breathe, while women stagger under skirts wide enough to block a doorway. Lace collars rise so high around your neck they feel like portable guillotines, and the heavier the embroidery, the more respectable you supposedly are. Forget comfort. Fashion is a punishment disguised as status. Let's not skip the wigs. Nobles parade around with thick, curled monstrosities perched on their heads, and they're not just itchy. They're breeding grounds for lice. Add a splash of powder, often laced with lead, and you've got a perfect recipe for hair loss, skin irritation, and in some cases, slow poisoning. Think of it as medieval hairspray that also doubles as a death sentence. You complain today about scratchy sweaters. Imagine wearing an entire chemistry experiment on your scalp. Cosmetics were no safer. The pale powdered face was the ultimate look of refinement, but that powder often contained mercury and arsenic. Women would smear it across their cheeks to achieve the fashionable deathly pallor, unaware or maybe ignoring that their beauty routine was shaving years off their lives. Add to that a splash of perfume, which had to be strong enough to mask the city's ever-present stench, and suddenly walking around Madrid is like living inside a toxic cloud. Would you trade your bottle of modern deodorant for musk extracted from deer glands? Didn't think so. Even ordinary folk weren't free from impracticality. A poor laborer might patch his clothes a dozen times until fabric barely held together, yet still be expected to wear something respectable to avoid suspicion of laziness. Shoes were stiff-heavy and blister-inducing, the kind of footwear that makes you wonder if barefoot would actually be better. And during hot summers, those layers of wool velvet and linen turn your body into a slow-cooking stew. No wonder fainting in church was practically a pastime. But here's the kicker. People wore these outfits not just for themselves, but as a visible declaration of social rank. Step outside without the right frills, and you risked being judged, or worse, fined by the sumptuary laws that dictated what each class could wear. Imagine if police stopped you on the street today because your sneakers looked too expensive for your income bracket. That was Spain enforcing social order down to the buttons on your sleeves. After wrestling with wigs, collars, and fabrics that could double as medieval straitjackets, you're probably hoping at least breakfast will offer some comfort. Sorry to disappoint. Unless you're lounging in a noble's estate, your morning meal is closer to survival fuel than a feast. The average citizen of Madrid in the Spanish Empire starts the day with stale bread softened in watered-down wine, or maybe a thin broth barely worthy of the name soup. It's the kind of meal that fills the stomach just enough to keep you from collapsing, but never enough to energize you. Bread is the staple, always bread. Wheat was highly prized, but expensive, so poorer families often relied on barley or rye loaves that were dense, dark, and tough on the jaw. Pair it with olive oil if you're lucky, or a smear of garlic paste if you're blessed. But more often than not, it's just bread, plain and dry. Remember how you complain when your toast pops up too crispy. Here you're gnawing on something closer to a brick. If you were a laborer, wine was practically mandatory. But don't picture fine Rioja aged in oak barrels. This was sour, watered-down stuff, consumed more to kill germs than to savor. Water itself was rarely trusted, so a cup of cheap wine diluted with even cheaper water was considered safer. Modern nutritionists might wince, but for them, it was liquid courage against the day ahead. And yes, even children drank it. Try imagining your school cafeteria serving watered-down Merlot with lunch trays. Protein was a rarity at breakfast. Maybe a scrap of cheese, a slice of dried sausage if your household was doing well that week. But meat was largely reserved for special occasions. Eggs, too, were not as common as you'd think, often saved for market rather than eaten at home. Milk. That was for calves. Most adults considered it strange or even unhealthy to drink cow's milk, which makes your morning latte sound like a futuristic luxury. For the truly poor, hunger was the only consistent menu. Many households lived meal to meal, unsure whether tomorrow would bring bread at all. Historians often note how food shortages shaped public unrest in Spain, sparking riots when bread prices rose too high. You might laugh at modern panic buying of toilet paper, but imagine crowds storming bakeries because their families hadn't eaten in 2 days. That was real desperation baked into every crust. Imagine waking up and realizing even the simplest act, like sprinkling salt on your breakfast, feels like it carries a fee. That was life under the Spanish Empire, where taxes reached into every corner of daily survival. From salt and soap to wine candles, and even the parchment for writing a simple letter, the crown had a levy waiting. It wasn't enough to earn a living. You had to budget for the privilege of just existing. Think of your modern shopping bill. Then imagine each item priced 3 times over before it even reached your hands. Salt stood out as the cruelest example. It preserved meat-flavored bland bread and kept families alive through winter. Without it, food rotted. With it, households emptied their pockets. Soap, too, carried its own surcharge, making cleanliness a luxury many couldn't afford. The result? Entire streets that smelled like fermenting compost. When travelers passed through Madrid, they didn't just write about the palaces, they commented on the stench. People didn't necessarily want to be dirty. They simply couldn't pay to be clean. At the heart of this system was Spain's endless appetite for revenue. Despite galleons sailing back from the Americas weighed down with silver, the empire was drowning in debt. Wars across Europe, palaces that consumed fortunes, and royal extravagance left a financial black hole. Ordinary citizens were the ones thrown into it. Picture King Philip II overseeing his grand Escorial monastery palace, a symbol of power and piety, while somewhere nearby, a farmer sold his last chicken to pay off yet another levy. Then came the dreaded alcabala, a sales tax so pervasive it shadowed every transaction. If you grew onions, you paid it. The merchant who bought them paid it again. The customer at the market paid it once more. By the time that onion landed in a stew, it had carried more tax weight than nutrition. Smuggling wasn't just rebellion, it was survival. People bent rules not out of greed, but because following them meant starvation. Even nobles weren't entirely free. Yes, they had exemptions, but the image of grandeur, embroidered clothes, carriages and servants demanded constant spending. They could lean on peasants to cover the shortfall, but you had only your own tired body to exploit. Imagine scrolling your monthly bills today and spotting charges like shoe tax or lamp tax. For Spaniards, that wasn't a dystopian joke. It was Tuesday. If the taxes didn't keep you on edge, the sound of church bells certainly would. They rang not just to mark time, but as a constant reminder of who really watched over your life. In the Spanish Empire, religion wasn't simply a matter of personal belief. It was the air you breathed, the rhythm of every day, and the leash wrapped tightly around your thoughts. A single careless word against the church, even whispered in a tavern, could be enough to ruin you. You didn't just live under a monarchy. You lived under the shadow of the Inquisition. Picture it. You walk into a plaza and see a public trial unfolding. A trembling man accused of holding unapproved books, a woman accused of practicing strange folk remedies, maybe even someone suspected of failing to attend Mass regularly. Whether or not they were guilty didn't matter as much as the spectacle. Confessions could be forced, reputations shredded, and punishment staged for everyone to see. Fear wasn't a side effect of the system. It was the fuel that kept it alive. The Inquisition kept lists. It investigated rumors. It leaned on neighbors to spy on neighbors. Imagine being afraid of your own dinner table conversations because your servant or a passing guest might carry a tale to the authorities. Today, we joke about phones listening in. Back then, the idea that someone might be listening was not paranoia, it was daily life. Silence became its own kind of survival skill. But religion wasn't only about threats, it was also a kind of theater. Churches dazzled with gilded altars, colossal paintings, and incense thick enough to choke you. Services were long, solemn, and unavoidable. Even if your stomach rumbled from hunger or your feet ached from work attendance wasn't optional. To miss Mass was to raise suspicion, and suspicion was a dangerous luxury. Think of the hours you complain about standing in line at the DMV, then double them, and add chanting in Latin you don't understand. That's your Sunday. And yet, people clung to faith sincerely, even desperately. For many, it was the only comfort in a world of disease, poverty, and political chaos. The Virgin Mary saints and processions filled the streets with color and song, offering brief moments of beauty amid the misery. Still, you knew in the back of your mind that one wrong glance, one wrong phrase could flip devotion into danger. Living in the Spanish Empire meant walking a tightrope where faith kept you upright and fear kept you from falling. Now that you've survived the church bells and kept your mouth shut during Mass, it's time to face the real backbone of the empire work. Forget romantic images of knights and explorers. Most people spent their lives bent over fields, hammering in workshops, or sweating in shipyards. From dawn to dusk, your body wasn't your own. It belonged to whoever had the power to demand it. Imagine your alarm clock going off, not with a gentle chime, but with a neighbor shouting that if you don't get moving, you'll lose your day's wage and maybe your supper. In the countryside, peasants tilled land that often wasn't theirs. Vast estates or latifundios dominated Spain, and noble landlords collected rent, whether harvests were good or bad. Your tools were simple. Your back was the plow horse, and your reward was just enough grain to keep going. Ever tried gardening and thought pulling weeds was exhausting? Multiply that by 10 hours under the sun, 6 days a week, and you'll have a glimpse of peasant life. And if drought struck, famine was never far behind. Cities weren't easier. Workshops hummed with the clatter of looms, the pounding of blacksmiths, and the scraping of tanners. Each craft meant long apprenticeships and endless repetition. A silversmith, for example, might spend years perfecting intricate designs for chalices destined for cathedrals, only to remain poor, while merchants reaped the profit. Labor wasn't just physical. It was also a hierarchy of masters, journeymen, and apprentices, where the bottom rung often meant sleeping in the shop and eating scraps. You think unpaid internships are bad. At least they don't usually involve breathing fumes from molten metal. Then, there were the shipyards, where Spain's mighty galleons took shape. These were floating fortresses, and building them was brutal. Trees had to be felled, timber-shaped sails, stitched ropes, woven all by hand. Workers hauled beams heavier than themselves, hammered iron nails until their fingers blistered and braced against the stench of tar and sweat. For every triumphant ship that set sail, countless anonymous backs had already broken. When we admire the Armada in history books, we rarely think of the men coughing their lungs out from years of sawdust. Women worked too often without recognition. Some labored in textile trades, spinning and weaving. Others sold food in markets or took in washing. Many simply kept households afloat, while men trudged off to toil elsewhere. And children, they weren't spared. A child old enough to walk was old enough to carry buckets, sweep floors, or watch animals. Childhood, as you know it, school games, free afternoons, was a luxury reserved for the wealthy few. For the rest, life was a job description. You drag your sore feet through the dust of Madrid, and a carriage suddenly cuts through the crowd, horses shining velvet curtains, swaying footmen barking for space. In that single moment, the Spanish Empire's cruel hierarchy shows itself. While you shuffle home with blisters and sweat nobles glide past untouched by mud, their faces barely visible behind silks. The gap isn't just wide. It feels like another world entirely, one you'll never step into, no matter how hard you work. The aristocrats lived by display. Their wardrobes dripped with imported fabrics, their tables glittered with silver, and their estates teemed with servants ready to bow at a snap. They rarely dirtied their hands with labor. Instead, they collected rents, extracted fees, and signed documents that sent money flowing in their direction. And yet many of these nobles were drowning in debt themselves. They borrowed endlessly to maintain appearances to keep up the show of grandeur. The entire system was a theater of status, lavish on the surface, fragile underneath. For commoners, there was no illusion. You worked the land that wasn't yours, owing rent you could never fully pay. Debts stacked higher than the rooftops owed to landlords, merchants, and the crown itself. Miss a payment, and you might lose your house, your tools, or even your freedom. Some debtors ended up in prison families, left to fend for themselves. You grumble today about a late credit card bill, but back then, debt wasn't paperwork, it was shackles. The so-called middle class, merchants' lawyers, and minor officials stood on shaky ground too. They earned more than peasants, but the stone wall of nobility blocked any real social ascent. In Spain, status wasn't bought with coin. It was inherited with blood. Born noble, you were untouchable. Born outside of it, you could work yourself to the bone and still remain branded as low. That immovable ceiling crushed ambition, locking countless families into cycles they could never break. And hovering above all this was the church preaching obedience and humility, reminding everyone that kings ruled by divine right. To question your place wasn't just rebellion against the crown, it was rebellion against God himself. That belief stitched inequality into the very soul of society. Yet resentment was never far away. You saw it in the hollow stares of beggars watching those carriages roll by, in the muttered complaints over mugs of cheap wine. The empire looked strong, unshakable, eternal. But beneath the gilded surface, frustration cracked quietly like ice before it breaks. The empire loved to boast about its colonies, but for you, stepping aboard a ship bound for the New World feels more like stepping into a floating coffin. The galleon looms over the dock, its hull dark with tar ropes creaking as sailors shout orders in a dozen dialects. Crowds push around you, traders with goods, priests with crosses, soldiers with muskets, and then you're shoved up the gangplank. Once the anchor lifts, you realize land won't be yours again for months. Life at sea is misery packaged as duty. Space below deck is tighter than you imagined, with hammocks strung inches apart, the air thick with sweat and mildew. Rats scurry across barrels nibbling at biscuits, already crawling with weevils. Fresh water runs out quickly, leaving you with sour wine or brackish sludge. Meals are monotonous hardtack, so tough it could chip teeth dried beans and salted meat that sometimes writhes with maggots. And seasickness. It greets you the first night and refuses to leave. Try sleeping when your stomach insists the floor is tilting. Storms are the true terror. One minute you're staring at calm seas, the next, black clouds swallow the sky. Waves slam the deck like giant fists, Ropes snap, sails shred, and men pray louder than the wind howls. Ships vanish without a trace, swallowed whole by storms, leaving only rumors drifting back across the Atlantic. Even survivors stumble ashore, gaunt, scarred, and half-deaf from the roar of the ocean. Today, you complain about turbulence on a 2-hour flight. Back then, an ocean crossing could scar you for life. Disease thrives on these voyages. Scurvy creeps in, after weeks, without fresh fruit gums, swelling until teeth loosen and fall. Dysentery spreads like wildfire in the cramped quarters, one bucket serving dozens of men. You've never valued a glass of clean water until you don't have it. And if the sickness doesn't strike you, boredom does. Days blur into weeks, broken only by chores, scrubbing decks, hauling ropes, patching sails. Time stretches like the horizon, endless and punishing. When land finally appears, relief is tempered by dread. You're not stepping into paradise, you're stepping into a furnace of heat, insects, and back-breaking labor. Tales of golden cities lure people from Spain, but the reality is sweat, disease, and toil. You'll discover soon enough that the colonies are less about glory and more about survival. The first thing that greets you in the colonies isn't gold, it's heat. The jungle presses against your lungs, humid and relentless, buzzing with insects that bite through cloth and skin alike. Sweat runs into your eyes before you've even lifted a finger, and already the overseer is shouting for workers to line up. Forget the dreamy paintings of palm trees and riches. This is survival in a place that seems designed to break you. If you're unlucky, you're sent into the silver mines of Potosi, high in the Andes. The mountain there was called the mountain that eats men, and not without reason. Tunnels twist deep into the earth, choking with dust and darkness. Candles gutter out quickly, leaving you grope forward with lungs filling with poisonous air. Hours blur into days, your back bent under sacks of ore heavier than your own body. Collapse is common. Escape is impossible. Every ingot of silver that made its way back to Spain was paid for in blood and breath. In the lowlands, the story isn't kinder. Plantations demand endless labor, cutting cane under a punishing sun, hauling loads until shoulders split, or grinding grain until arms shake. Malaria and yellow fever stalk every worker striking without warning. A single mosquito bite can leave you delirious with fever, and medical care is as crude as it was back in Madrid. Many simply don't wake up again, and still the overseer's voice rises at dawn as if death itself were just another part of the schedule. Even those in charge weren't entirely safe. Spanish officials and soldiers stationed here often lived in a cycle of fear. Fear of uprisings from the local population, fear of raids, fear of being forgotten by the empire they served. Letters home took months, sometimes years to arrive, if they survived the ocean crossing at all. Isolation ate at men's minds. You think homesickness today is rough after a semester abroad? Imagine it stretching into decades with no guarantee of return. But the most haunting truth is how normal it all became. Children born in the colonies grew up in this rhythm of sweat and scarcity, never knowing another way. To them, the constant hunger, the swarms of insects, the sickness that claimed neighbors, it was just life. For newcomers like you, though, every day feels like a battle you're steadily losing. Spain boasted of its empire's wealth, but for those forced to dig, carry, and bleed for it, the wealth was always somewhere else. You brace yourself for another day, but the real shadow following you isn't hunger or heat, it's disease. In the Spanish Empire, sickness moved faster than armies, striking towns, villages, and ships with terrifying speed. Imagine walking through a city street where every other doorway is marked with chalk or straw to signal illness inside. You can almost hear the silence behind those doors. Families whispering prayers, hoping the fever passes their house by. Plague had been Europe's companion for centuries, and Spain was no exception. Outbreaks flared unpredictably, carried by fleas, rats, and trade routes. When it arrived, entire neighborhoods emptied bodies carried to pits by cartloads. Survivors learned to keep distance. But how do you avoid contagion when water comes from the same bucket and bread from the same baker's hands? Masks weren't leather beaks filled with herbs. Here those were for doctors in Italy and France. But the fear was the same. Fevers haunted the empire too. Malaria in the colonies, typhus in the cities, smallpox striking without mercy. A single sneeze could carry consequences, and recovery was never guaranteed. With no antibiotics, no vaccines, and little understanding of germs, treatments ranged from leeches to bleeding to prayers. Sometimes they helped, but more often they just weakened you further. People trusted charmed saints or pilgrimages more than medicine, because what else could they cling to? Even the wealthy weren't safe. Nobles locked themselves in country estates when outbreaks hit Madrid, but servants still moved between kitchens and markets carrying illness with them. Royals themselves weren't spared. King Philip IV lost several children to disease despite all the empire's resources. In a cruel way, sickness was the great equalizer. Whether peasant or prince, one bad fever could end your story. Doesn't that sound uncomfortably familiar, given how recently we've seen cities fall silent during a pandemic? Ships became floating incubators. A galleon crossing the Atlantic might set out with hundreds and arrive with barely two-thirds, the rest claimed by scurvy dysentery, or fevers contracted in foreign ports. Those who survived limped off the deck skeletal, and weak only to be thrown into brutal work again. It makes the complaints about airplane food feel embarrassingly small. And yet, despite the constant threat, people pressed forward. Streets reopened, bells rang again, and life stumbled back into rhythm until the next wave struck. In the Spanish Empire, you didn't ask if disease would come, you asked when. And by then, you'd better hope your body could endure what prayers could not. Step into a town square, and you'll see why people walked carefully. Punishment wasn't something hidden behind prison walls. It was staged in front of everyone, loud and unforgettable. Authorities believed fear worked better than reform, so justice came wrapped in spectacle. Stocks and pillories stood ready to hold offenders, locking heads and hands in wood, while crowds jeered through rotten food, or worse. It wasn't just about the guilty suffering, it was about everyone else watching and learning the price of stepping out of line. Whippings were routine, carried out by officials with practiced cruelty. A thief, a debtor, even someone who broke minor trade rules might be tied to a post and lashed until their back ran raw. The pain was only part of the punishment. The humiliation of standing exposed with neighbors and strangers alike watching cut almost as deep. It was social death, ensuring you carried shame long after the wounds healed. People feared public disgrace as much as they feared the lash. Executions turned into full-blown theater. Gallows were built tall and visible so the crowd could see from every angle. Hangings, beheadings, and burnings were staged with ritual precision. Priests stood by urging repentance, while townsfolk whispered about the condemned. Were they wicked unlucky, or victims of politics? For rulers, these events weren't just about justice. They were demonstrations of power, reminders that the empire's grip extended into every heartbeat. Attendance wasn't optional. missing an execution could raise eyebrows as if you secretly sympathized with the condemned. Not all punishments were bloody. Sometimes humiliation did the job. People might be paraded through streets wearing dunce caps or riding backward on donkeys, signs hung around their necks announcing their crime. These punishments relied on laughter, not pain, but the effect could still destroy reputations. In a society built on honor, mockery could cut deeper than chains. Imagine being roasted on social media today, but with no chance to delete the post, and no escape from the crowd pointing and laughing in the flesh. Even the smallest rule breakers weren't safe. A child caught stealing apples could be whipped. A beggar accused of dishonesty might be shackled in irons. Discipline reached everyone, reinforcing the idea that order came before compassion. The Spanish Empire valued control above comfort, and the message was clear: step out of line, and you'd be made an example. For you standing in that square, it's not a question of innocence or guilt. It's the dread of realizing that at any moment you could be the one on display. Marriage in the Spanish Empire wasn't about love first, it was about survival, property, and reputation. Families arranged unions to secure alliances, strengthen business ties, or consolidate land. You might be hoping for romance, but the ceremony you attend feels more like a contract signing than a celebration. Priests recite blessings, relatives whisper about dowries, and the young couple exchange vows with the weight of entire families pressing on their shoulders. Love could come later, perhaps, or not at all. Dowries were serious business. A bride's family was expected to provide money, land, or goods, ensuring the groom's household gained security in exchange for taking on a wife. Fail to meet expectations, and the match might collapse before it began. For poorer families, dowries could sink them into debt, and sometimes a daughter's future depended on how much her parents could scrape together. It wasn't just two people being joined, it was two balance sheets colliding. Jealousy thrived in this atmosphere. Affairs happened whispered about in taverns or scrawled into letters, but discovery was dangerous. Women accused of infidelity could be disgraced, or worse, while men risked duels, legal punishment, or losing honor in the eyes of peers. Imagine walking into a plaza and seeing two men's swords drawn not for treasure or politics, but because of whispered rumors over a wife or mistress. Blood might settle what courts couldn't. Still, affection found its way in. Love letters survived from the era filled with earnest longing, secret promises, and dramatic flourishes. Couples sneaked glances in churches, exchanged tokens in crowded markets, or shared hurried conversations in the shadow of watchful relatives. Romance had to exist quietly, hidden between the strict lines drawn by family and faith. And for many, the risk made it more intoxicating. Think about how even today, forbidden relationships still carry a certain thrill. That same heartbeat echoed centuries ago. Betrayal, though, was never far behind. Wealthy widows became targets for fortune hunters. Grooms discovered their brides' dowries smaller than promised. Families quarreled over inheritances until bonds shattered. In a society obsessed with honor, personal betrayal spilled into public disgrace. Gossip traveled faster than truth, and once your name was tainted, it was almost impossible to wash it clean. In Spain, love wasn't just a feeling. It was a battlefield, fought with contracts, jealousy, and the ever-present fear of dishonor. By the time night falls, you're desperate for a break, and the tavern door creaks open like a promise. Inside, smoke hangs low, candlelight flickers on rough-hewn tables, and the smell of sour wine mingles with sweat and roasted meat. This is where the empire loosens its belt, where peasant soldiers and even minor officials gather to forget for a few hours how hard the day has been. The tavern is noisy, chaotic, and alive, and for you, stepping inside feels like entering a different world. The wine is cheap and sharp, served in clay cups that stain your lips purple. Food, if you can afford it, is simple: a hunk of cheese, salted fish, or maybe a plate of olives. Nothing here is luxurious, but it's warmer than your cold room, and the company makes it taste better. Conversations rise and fall like waves. Farmers grumble about harvests. Sailors boast of voyages that may or may not have happened, and gamblers argue over dice tumbling across the table. Gambling is everywhere. Dice clatter cards, slap coins slide from hand to hand. Wagers range from pocket change to livestock, and tempers flare quickly when luck turns sour. One moment, laughter roars at a winning throw. The next, fists fly, benches topple, and the tavern keeper shouts for order. Brawls are almost a form of entertainment expected as part of the evening. If you thought bar fights were just movie cliches, the Spanish tavern proves otherwise. Music sometimes cuts through the noise. A wandering guitarist strums a melancholy tune, and voices join in with ballads about lost love or heroes long gone. Songs bind the crowd together, reminding everyone that even in hardship, there's still joy to be found. For a few verses, you forget the debts, the taxes, and the overseer's shouts. Then the song ends, and reality returns, carried on the smell of spilled wine. But the tavern is also dangerous. Too much drink loosens tongues, and words spoken too loudly might be carried beyond these walls. A careless joke about the crown or the church could follow you into the street and straight into the hands of the authorities. You sip cautiously, listening more than speaking, because you've already learned one thing in the empire: silence often keeps you safer than laughter. And when dawn comes with its bells and demands, you'll stumble out with a heavy head, only to do it all over again. Step back out of the tavern's warmth, and the streets remind you of reality. Lanterns flicker weakly, casting long shadows over figures huddled against walls. Beggars line the alleys, wrapped in rags, their hands stretched out for coins you probably don't have. Children with hollow eyes curl up under stairways, shivering through the night. These aren't just unlucky few. They're the inevitable product of an empire where poverty outnumbers wealth 100 to 1. Poor houses and hospitals exist, but they're grim places. Inside, you find orphans packed into drafty halls, widows tending fires with little fuel, and the sick left to cough in shared beds. Charitable orders try to provide, but resources are thin and demand is endless. Life expectancy here isn't measured in decades so much as in hopes of surviving the next winter. If you've ever complained about a crowded waiting room, imagine lying on straw beside a stranger burning with fever, both of you praying for food that never comes. The empire's social ladder doesn't offer many rungs for these souls. Born poor, you stay poor. Without land, without family connections, without even a proper trade, people fall into a spiral that no amount of effort can break. The streets are filled with men who once served in wars, now reduced to begging, and women who lost dowries, or husbands now left with nothing but children to feed. Society whispers about laziness, but the truth is harsher. The system leaves no way out. Even crime doesn't guarantee survival. Petty thieves risk the lash, or worse yet, desperation pushes them anyway. Markets are watched closely. Taverns keep their eyes open, and punishments are public enough to discourage most. Still, When your stomach has been empty for 3 days, risk feels smaller than hunger. That's how cycles of misery kept repeating generation after generation. Travelers from other parts of Europe noticed this sharp divide. They wrote about Spain's proud palaces and grand churches standing side by side with beggars who looked more like skeletons. The contrast shocked outsiders, but locals had grown numb to it. You might look at these ragged faces and think, this is temporary. But for them, this was life, and as you walk past their outstretched hands, you feel the unshakable weight of knowing this is where the empire's promises end in silence and shadows at the edge of the street. By the time the sun rises again, your body has nothing left to give. The streets you stumbled through yesterday feel heavier now, the noise sharper, the air thicker. Hunger gnaws at you, your head aches from sour wine, and your hands tremble from exhaustion. Every step feels like wading through mud, even when the road is dry. You thought surviving one day in the Spanish Empire would be a challenge, but here you are, barely standing, already broken. Your stomach twists at the sight of food stalls, knowing you can't afford even a crust of bread. Debt lurks like a shadow the tax collector's knock, just as frightening as the priest's sermon or the soldier's boots. Work waits, but your muscles scream, and your spirit whispers that there's no point. You've seen too much already. The nobles who glide past in velvet, the beggars left to rot in alleys, the punishments staged like plays. The empire promised order and glory, but to you it delivers only weight. Even hope feels thin. The church bells toll again, but instead of reassurance, they sound like reminders that nothing will change. Inquisitors still listen. Overlords still demand. Illness still stalks the streets. Your body is fragile, and your place in society is fixed. There's no climbing, no escaping, no rewinding the day you agreed to step into this world. You once thought you could endure, but now you see the truth. Endurance here isn't measured in years. It's measured in how long before collapse. The cruelest part is how ordinary it all seems to those around you. For the merchant haggling in the plaza, the soldier polishing his musket, the child darting barefoot through muck, this is life. They don't question it, because to them, this isn't cruelty, it's normal. But to you, newly dropped into this world, the weight crushes before the day even ends. You aren't a hero, a conquistador, or a noble. You're just another body swallowed by the rhythm of the empire. And so, when your knees finally buckle and the crowd moves around you without pausing, it feels fitting. Spain doesn't notice the loss of one more tired soul. The empire grinds on demanding more labor, more taxes, more silence. Your day has ended, but for everyone else, the cycle begins again. That is why, in the Spanish Empire, you wouldn't last a day. And so, as the echoes of bells fade and the crowded streets of the Spanish Empire drift in memory, you can let go of the weight of that day. You've seen the carriages roll past, the taxes crush the taverns roar, and the mines swallow men whole. You've tasted bread hard as stone, felt debts pressed like chains, and watched punishments turn into theater. Through it all, you've learned that beneath Spain's golden image was a life built on exhaustion, hunger, and fear. But now you don't have to walk those streets anymore. Close your eyes, let the noise quiet, and allow yourself to drift into rest safe in knowing history can stay in the past while your dreams carry you gently forward.